Recording. Hello. It's going to be the second video, I guess the second full video that I'm doing in a random series of writing videos and media videos. And this one is on the writing process. And it's about three parts. First, just getting started, just getting ideas down, brainstorming and planning. Second is using stock characters and homages and pre-existing material as part of getting through a first draft, getting through your very first imagining of a work. And then third will be about revising for mood and impact, as well as making the work more personal by word choice and by the kinds of things you include. Okay, I'm probably going to spend the most time on characters, the second part, using pre-existing characters, because this is kind of just a pet interest of mine. Tropes and archetypes and all of that, so I'll probably have a lot to say on it. And the revising section might run short, to be real, because I don't know, we'll see what I have to say about it. So we'll get started with getting started. This first idea of power writing, I'm going to cite a professor I had, Goldberry Long. She called this power writing, and it's basically automatic writing or free writing, with the focus in mind of developing a story idea, developing characters, developing themes that you want to explore, and also exploring like autobiographical events, sort of diary entry type things about things that happened to you recently that you feel strongly about and want to explore more and want to see from multiple perspectives and understand better and all of that. You know, the kind of stuff that writers write about. Love and conflict and arguments and political situations and all of that. We'll get to all of that. Okay. The rule one, though, of power writing is don't stop writing. And whether you're power writing a draft of a scene or you're power writing just an outline of a scene, you're going to want to use words that aren't the perfect word. You know, you're imagining like, oh, he looked at the view and the view was, what's the word? Don't get caught up in that in the power writing stage, in the first draft stage. You will have days to think about that one section that needs the perfect word. Don't get caught up in that. Just use the word that is not the right word. Use an imprecise word. Use the cousin of the perfect word, I think is what Mark Twain calls it. But he's advising actually using the perfect word and not its cousin. But that's for revision. That comes later. When you're power writing, when you're just getting started, you just want to get all your ideas down. As many ideas as you have when you're writing, when you're at the computer or with the notebook and pen and pencil or whatever, or just texting yourself on your phone. I use, as you might imagine, video for this very thing. While I'm walking somewhere to school or back, those are the places I go, school and home. When I'm walking, a lot of times I'll make videos and I'll tell myself stories that are incomplete, that I don't know all the steps to, but by talking them out, um, you know, your natural kind of logic for storytelling and for continuity and all of that takes hold, and you keep, and you sort of reconstruct the events, almost like it was a memory, like it was a movie you had seen before. And sometimes that's because you're drawing from cliches, you're drawing from stuff you've actually seen before, but, you know, you got to get a first draft done somehow. And homages are part of that. They're definitely part of that. Cliches as well. When you come to a stopping point like, oh, what's this character's name? Use any name. Seriously. For the first draft, it doesn't matter. And I resist this sometimes. I'm like, oh, I have to pick a name. I have to settle on a name because I use nicknames a lot. And obviously, if I pick one name and then I make a bunch of nicknames off of it, characters make fun of this character's name, and then I decide I don't really like that name, and I gotta change a bunch of dialogue. So I feel that pressure of picking a name for a character soon before you start writing and get into writing, but just name them A, B, C, Guy 1, Guy 2, Girl 1. Just name them after your friends or an existing set of character names. So it looks like you're doing fan fiction, but you're actually changing all the characters. Like, just use random names. Use celebrity names. Use horoscopes or something. Just call them anything at first in this initial stage of just get your ideas down. Power write, auto write. Sometimes you have to use cliches in a character's construction, in a character's name, in a plot, in the way these characters solve a problem. You can't get too hung up on being like creative and original in your first draft. You really can't, because then you're going to second guess everything you do, especially if you're doing something like science fiction or fantasy, where everything you know about the genre comes from that genre. Like, there's almost nothing in the real world to inform what you're doing. So when you're writing about space travel, you're writing from the perspective of all the science fiction you've seen. So you're going to be copying to some extent, especially in early drafts before you figure out some of the details and some of the things that would, some of the cliches that if you used them, they would break your story or disrupt the laws and logic of your story, so you can't use them. You'll stumble across that stuff, and it'll help reduce the cliches in your first draft. I don't know if that part made sense. I might have to edit some of that. But don't stop. That's the key. Just keep going. It's like live music. If you play an instrument, or even if you just sing along with the radio or something, you know that you can't go back and unsing something. You can't fill a silence that you let pass. You just have to keep going and keep building and keep working with what you've done, even if part of what you've done is imperfect. It's the idea in comedy of yes and. You just accept what you have down, and you just say, okay, what can I add to it? What can I do to make it better? And sometimes you add stuff that's totally incompatible with some of your first ideas, but you just kind of overwrite that, and you just keep adding and keep adding and keep adding. And you arrive at great places, really. I was just having that specific discussion with a friend recently. So, yes, that's part one. Just don't stop writing. A good way to do this is to set a page limit or a page minimum. Set a quota for yourself, basically, with either how many pages you'll write, how many pages you'll type, or how long you'll work. And that works really well, especially because sometimes a page length can be intimidating. It's like, oh, I gotta fill a page, I don't want to fill it with crap, I gotta think. It's like, no, you know, thinking's a problem, because if you're thinking, you're negating things. You're basically cycling through stuff and saying, why can't I use this, why can't I use this? You gotta just use everything, throw everything at it in your initial draft. And I'm going to mangle this Stephen King quote. I probably should have looked it up, done proper research. But he says something to the effect of, sometimes you're actually producing decent work when it feels like you're shoveling shit from a sitting position. And I really, that's just one of those things that will help me get started sometimes. It's like, oh, I don't have any ideas. It's like, but you gotta go. It's time to shovel shit. It's time to get that words on the page. You have new ideas since the last time you thought about this story, even if you can't really, even if it doesn't seem like you have. You've thought about the situation, you've imagined it more, you've fleshed it out, you've given it thought, you've learned new things. You know, me, I'm constantly studying just weird things to try to incorporate them into stories, history, and archetypes, and all sorts of stuff that takes up my time. And just life experiences, too. You can work that all in. Don't feel like you can't write anything. Don't feel like, oh, that's too cliche. Don't feel like, oh, I can't bother with that. Okay. Motivational speech. Now, go and write a bunch after you listen to the next part. Okay. Number 2, stock characters. And this relates strongly to the first part. And I have mixed feelings, I should say up front, because my mixed feelings will probably come through as I make this next part. Stock characters are a terrific starting point. They are wonderful for outlining an idea and brainstorming an idea. But the more you develop it, the more you work with the story, the more things become unique, and the more you should allow that to happen. Because that's what will make your story interesting, is when you add those personal elements on top of sort of familiar character archetypes that have proven themselves to work well in other things. So, okay, talking about stock characters, I have a bunch of notes for this, a bunch of different paradigms. I'll start with the easiest one, and I didn't write this part down, but I thought about it. I think I mentioned it in one of my walking to school videos where I ramble on like this, but I don't post it. The most basic setup, obviously, is going to be a single character. Okay, duh. For a second character, though, you know, you have an assignment, you've never really written a story, or you have something. You have no idea where to start. This video is for you. So you have one character. That character is probably going to be you, or someone you know, which is cool. No judging. So you have your first character, and the easiest thing to do, and this can be fraught with problems if your first character is too based on yourself, but the easiest thing to do with your first character when you need a second character is just to make an opposite of this character. You know, an opposite of your first character. And in literature, they call the second character a foil, because they reflect on the first character, basically. And they make your strong girl seem so much more strong because the guy she's with can't lift anything at all. You know, that would be a foil to use. The other thing you could do is, and this can also be full of problems, but you can have a really smart character and a really stupid character. You can have a really direct and honest character, and then a character that never says exactly what they mean either way, and they're sort of subverted in their meanings. And the other, you know, the first character always has to think, like, what is that about? You know, you can vary two characters in a lot of different ways. And I think a lot of stories and scenes that can be later turned into larger works can be started solidly with just two characters who are not like each other in some dramatic way, in some way that presents itself through dialogue and action. Okay. So that's the twosomes. You can have two characters who are the same, but why? Just have one character speaking to themselves, really. We're used to that in fiction. You know, somebody on stage just soliloquizing, just talking to themselves. Or somebody in a book just, you know, dear diary, things are miserable. You know, we can deal with one character talking to themselves. Two characters who are the same talking to each other gets disorienting. It's like, why have them both there? So make them different in some important way. Some way that presents itself throughout the story. Or people won't know why you have two characters. This is another tip, related tip, moving into these larger number character ensembles I'm about to talk about, is resist the impulse to have a new character for every new situation. Like, you have a hero and maybe a sidekick, and then every 2 or 3 minutes they come across a new person entirely. That, you know, it takes a lot of creativity, for one. And if you feel like you have to hold yourself to that standard, too, you'll get exhausted. And halfway through, you'll be like, damn, I cannot think of a new character for them to encounter. I guess my story is just going to sit for a while until I can think of some new kind of monster. You know, that's part of the trouble when you get this new character overload. Another part of the problem, though, is things start to feel too disconnected if the story doesn't interweave. If the characters don't all, not maybe all, but if most of the characters don't come back into the story and rework into the story at some point, then it just feels like a mess. The story just feels like a bunch of happenings. And it doesn't feel as thought out. It doesn't feel as polished and professional. And maybe that's just because of the media we're used to, and maybe in 100 years it'll be totally the opposite. It'll be like, no, you should have as many new characters as possible. You know, everything should be like Pokemon, just as many as you can throw in front of the screen. Don't care if people can memorize all of them, just keep throwing them on. But I am currently in a place where I think that economy of characters, almost like you're thinking of having to hire actors and train actors for a stage play. You know, like I only have 3 people I know that can read cue cards, so I have to write a play with 3 people, you know. I have to write a story with only that many people. Try to think like that, because then your stories will seem much more coherent. Your plot lines will all the characters can be going towards the same point instead of just having 50 different characters kind of fluttering by and messing with the plot here and there. So, okay, moving on from that disclaimer that took like 3 minutes. We're past the two sums on to the three sums. Okay, the easiest trio I think to make is, well, besides rock, paper, scissors, but I'm not sure how that would present itself in literature. The easiest trio is the Freudian trio. And there's a TV Tropes page about this. And you basically have a character for the id, the ego, and the superego. And the easiest way to summarize that is like base instinct or evil, or just lack of self-control, basically. Total self-control, total uptightness and rigidity. And then just sort of like normal ego, normal mediator of these two extreme positions. So yeah, base instinct, society, and logic, and then the person who has to decide between these two. And that leads me from the Freudian trio, which is sort of a kind of negative thing, to the Star Trek trio, which is very similar to this. I should explain myself. Basically the dynamic between Kirk, McCoy, and Spock. And it's very similar to the Freudian trio, but instead of base instinct as a sort of evil or selfish impulse, you have compassion and empathy being represented by McCoy, the doctor, the medical doctor. And then in the place of the superego, which would be morals and society, you have logic and science, which is represented by the science officer, Spock, who is purely logical, or at least the Vulcans think they're purely logical. But they're logic heavy. They're logic valuing people. They value logic. Okay. And then they have the third of this, which is the Kirk, which is kind of the superego and the ego in a way, because Kirk usually represents obedience to orders as well as the need to mitigate pure numbers and logic and science with the compassion voiced by McCoy. So, oftentimes that mediator character, that ego or that Kirk, will be the lead character because they're constantly choosing cold reason or warm compassion, basically, represented by the two other characters. Okay, so that's the Trek trio. I think there are different names for it, but I'm calling it the Trek trio. Because I like alliteration too much. Moving on from threes, related to this is the 5-person fantasy team. And you're asking what happened to groups of 4, and well, groups of 4 are kind of hard to write for, and I don't often use them, so okay. Number 5. Groups of 5. The Fantasy Guild. How do I explain this? In the Dungeons and Dragons starter pack a while ago, and it may still be the case, they had a set group that they gave you. And I always thought it was remarkably well balanced from not just like that game, the specific standpoint of that game, but from one, how much it stole from Lord of the Rings. But that aside, also it just struck me as a great balance of personalities, and it can be used outside of a fantasy setting, but it originates, as far as I know, as far as my measly research into this indicates, this specific thing kind of, it's sort of hinted at in Art of War, I think. Like the 5 men you need for a mission, and I should look that up later. I might add this in a later edit. Add that in a later edit. But it's the Fantasy Guild, to finally finish my long-winded sentence and introduction, is 1, the warrior hero, who is usually human, because humans like seeing humans and stuff. He usually uses a sword for all the imagery that carries with it. 2 is the elf mage, who is usually an aristocrat and uses knowledge and status in a way, sort of the privileged position of birth and the knowledge gained from it, as well as a magic wand or staff to fight, to contribute. That's number 2. Number 3, the dwarf warrior, the low-class axe wielder, who basically represents the blue-collar worker, more or less, you know, as the juxtaposition, or as the foil to the elfin mage who fights with magic and thoughts and moneyed knowledge gained through money, really. And the ego mediator, audience stand-in average guy of the warrior. The dwarf is also a sort of a foil to that. Number 4, you have the halfling thief, which can be a hobbit, but hobbits are trademarked, I think, so halflings. Your short people who are archers and pickpockets. That's usually your 4th character, who don't just represent the low class or the average person, they represent the criminal class, really, the kind of underbelly of society. And they also have to use sort of thoughts and forbidden knowledge to get ahead. That's the best way of putting it. Using their criminal class street smarts to contribute and get ahead. And then 5 is your healer, is your cleric, or your priest, can be another mage or sorcerer or something. Often this character is being escorted by the other characters, and they're not really out to adventure and murder things, and there are a lot of exceptions to this. But a lot of times this will be, this 5th slot of the healer will be represented by a pacifist character who doesn't fight. They really only heal and try to dodge and avoid and use diplomacy. And they're usually, I want to say they're usually high class, but their class can, like their financial background can vary. If they represent the church, they're usually more than covered in armor and adequately armed and such. But if they're just like some humble farm girl, then they'll probably represent a low-class position. So yes, that's the Fantasy Guild fivesome. Related to this fivesome is the Cabin in the Woods group, I guess, which is described in that movie as the virgin, I'm gonna get this one wrong. I forget what they call it. I think it's the virgin and the seductress. Let's call her that. Number 3, the athlete. Number 4 is the scholar, or the academic. And number 5 is the fool, or the joker, the jester. This dynamic is interesting to me because it's clear a lot of horror movies use that, and that's part of the impact. I guess I should have given a spoiler alert. If you haven't seen that movie, you're like, where did those 5 things come from? They come from later in the movie. Let's just say that. It's sort of self-aware and addressed in that regard. That the 5 characters of horror movies are the virgin, the seductress, the scholar, and the fool. And they basically represent different moral positions, different philosophies. And this is why I think they work outside of horror. The virgin basically represents society. Again, it's the morality handed down by society, and they're very much aware of that societal expectation of them to be pure and to be perfect and to be all of that. And sometimes they learn by the end of the movie that society is not right about something, and that for survival and life, you need to ignore it. And sometimes this character learns that society was right all along, and you should have listened to your parents, and you should have left a note, you should have called, you shouldn't have gone out partying. And then they learn that the punishment for all of that is a bloody massacre of a serial killer, something like that, or a monster, or communist aliens, something along those lines. They'll kill you for not listening to your parents. That's often what this first character represents. Alongside the foil, which is the seductress, or the whore, if you want to be dicey about it, it's this character of the whore is often killed first, or amongst the first, because they are a young woman who is sexually liberated, and I can't have that in my society. So that it gets killed. She gets killed almost right away. That character, even if they're a male character who is with some inconsequential female who has not yet been on camera, except for this one scene naked with this leading male character, this character, for being sexually immoral, will be murdered. That's sort of horror convention. If you use that character, you can not murder them, and you can just treat their behavior as somewhat normal. But they act as a nice foil. This sexually promiscuous character works as a nice foil for this uptight, society respecting character. And then you have the other 2 foils, or kind of 3 foils, the athlete and the academic. And the athlete is self-explanatory. They're a jock. They try to solve every problem with brute force or violence, or threats of violence, or yelling, just yells. But that doesn't always work. And a lot of times that character will be made powerless. And this is kind of one of the ways where horror movies, even if they're being conservative, not in like a super political way, but even if a horror movie is like killing off its sexually promiscuous characters, a lot of times it will still take the athlete character, the powerful character, and make them totally powerless and basically give them no fighting chance. And that's when things are like, oh, this thing's gonna murder all of us. You know, if that guy can't kill the monster, none of us can kill the monster. But it's also tied into like fears of impotence in men by taking the man and making him powerless. You see a lot of that in movies. Sometimes the jock character, I shouldn't say jock to offend, but this sort of muscular, athletic character, a lot of times they'll be the ones that survive, which can be strange in a way, but I guess it makes sense if men's men are writing these stories about manly men overcoming adversity, then I guess the bodybuilder would win. And there is some logic to it, I suppose. But usually they don't. Usually they get made powerless because that's scary. And then you have the academic who, in, again, a suddenly conservative way, and a lot of horror movies are kind of more conservative, not in like a partisan sense, conservative in like just old-fashioned values, I suppose. These conservative films, horror films, they'll have the academic characters who represent science and a need of scientific understanding and a lack of faith, basically. They'll have these characters need to understand the monster, need to study the monster, need to understand the phenomenon, the thing that's killing everyone, and they will be punished for that. And this kind of comes from, Romantic era literature where nature resists being understood. And if you even make the attempt, you will die. Nature will kill you. Nature will find a way to make your life horrible. The academic archetype often faces this. And then lastly, you have the fool, who is basically either drunk or high all the time. And again, this can be handled in a sort of conservative way where this character gets killed for this almost instantly, like, hey, let's go do drugs, oh, massacre. Or it can be treated, not to spoil things, like Cabin in the Woods does, where this character actually becomes very useful to the party as a whole as time goes on because of their role as the fool, the jester, the joker of the intoxicated one, basically. They are more willing to see things in the worst possible light, I guess. So they're more skeptical and cynical of things. Not really skeptical, but they're more cynical of the world in a way that allows them to quickly understand what is actually happening. Or sometimes they're just a drunken idiot and they get killed right away. That character can really be treated in a lot of different ways, but mostly they get the funny lines, and they break up tension as things get serious, as people get killed, as characters say things that are kind of cliche, but you would be expected to say in an emergency situation. This Joker fool character is usually the one to comment on the lines being said. Okay. Those are the character types. Oh no, I have one more character type in relation to stock characters and using these things to get through your first draft. The monomyth, or basically the story that everybody tells, to put it another way. essentially it's a condensed version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Iliad, the Odyssey, Beowulf, all of that, a bunch of that. And it takes all of those things and it identifies certain points in which these most popular stories are similar to each other in kind of this structural way in their themes and in the kinds of characters that come up and when they come up and when they die and when they overcome certain boundaries and when they make certain decisions and such. And this is sort of related also to plot, the monomyth, but I'm going to talk about it mostly from the point of view of characters. And actually, just if you use most of these characters, you will have seen their use so many times at certain points in movies and stories and books and games and all of that, that without me even having to spell out for you when you use these characters, you'll figure out when to use them and when to kill them and all of that. So you start off with the hero, and in Western, meaning European and Anglo-American art, the hero is usually male, but this is changing more and more often because we've seen it thousands and thousands of times done as a great heroic male, and it's becoming more and more exaggerated, really. If you see action movies now, like, men have to be beyond Superman. They have to be totally inhuman to be action heroes now, because the male action hero who solves everything with violence is so overused as a character that people just are getting sick of writing it, really. Excuse me. So, the hero, that's slot one, can be anyone, really. Can be young, old, male, female, whatever. So sometimes there are basically three schools of thought when it comes to your hero character in this monomyth structure. One, you can go the classical route and have it just be a really, really, really strong character who's sort of generic and almost has no personality other than just being strong and honorable in kind of an abstract way. You can have the hero be a totally normal person who is really struggling with everything like a normal person would, struggling with all these encounters and obstacles and enemies and such. A totally sort of bland, average person. Or you can have yourself as either sort of the bland person or as the superhero version of yourself in the story. And all three can fail for different reasons, but don't worry about that too much. Just get a draft done, and if problems arise with you either being too congratulatory of yourself, you can fix those. If problems arise where your character is too boring, too generic, then you can fix that later. If your character's just too unbelievably strong and sort of super, just too super, and there are no stakes because it doesn't seem like they could possibly fail because they can solve everything, then you can fix that. You can give them some more flaws later. So make your hero anything or any mix of these things. Just start. But those are three options for you. Two, and I talked about this, or this second slot, in this kind of monomyth, and there are a lot of slots in this, but I'm only going to talk about the main ones, sort of the main 9. I'm going to have to start speeding through them. The second slot is the antagonist, and if you're going to go with the kind of opera epic tradition, then your hero is masculine and manly over here, and then your villain is soft and feminine. And you've seen this a bunch of times. Basically, a gay villain, or a sometimes a villain that's a female who acts too masculine for the sensibilities of the times, so they're portrayed as a villain for that reason. The last episode of the original series of Star Trek is like that. A woman, a qualified woman who wants to be captain, basically goes crazy and takes over the ship and possesses Spock, or possesses Kirk, because she's such a feminist, and the movie handles that really, or that episode handles that really strangely, because it basically treats her as like, you should have known your place. But it's like, dude, she had a point. She just wanted to be able to fly a ship like any man, and there was this kind of BS regulation that said women couldn't be captains. Anyways, so sometimes your villain is they basically a lot of times represent something that is okay to attack politically, whether that's a man who acts gay or like a woman, or a man who acts like a woman, or just a greedy guy is kind of the most classic antagonist. A lot of times, though, I think the best antagonists are just sort of regular people who want something that directly conflicts with your hero character. And sports movies do this well sometimes, but I don't watch a lot of sports movies because actually they drop the ball on this a lot by having the people on the opposite team all be total jerks. And it's like, they don't need to be jerks. Like, you can just have a movie about two teams who both really want one thing, but you just happen to be following this one team. And like, they're funnier, so you care about them and want them to win or something. But that's a good example of having an antagonist character who has a reasonable want that just puts them in conflict with the first character. Okay, and then the third in this initial thing, they're different. You can argue for different people for this slot of number 3, but I'm going to say the mentor. The mentor, to me, is the thing that almost defines this plot. And it's the Obi-Wan, basically. It's the character who is the pederast, the old man who takes the young man on as an apprentice and teaches him all the ways of the world, and that allows him to succeed. And, I say pederast as sort of historical and ironic, joking thing. But, yes, this mentor character, and the fact that we don't think that the mentor character is suspicious for being so interested in this young person's life, that mentor character is a big part of this arc, and the sort of classical feeling and nature of this arc. That the young person needs to be taught what the heck to do, how to fight, how to argue, how to impress people, whatever it is, how to sports, and then they use that information from the mentor to succeed throughout the story. Now, getting into characters almost always in these movies or in these stories that need less explanation. The sidekick. The sidekick is basically a less serious counterpart to the hero. And a lot of times the hero will talk out loud and assess the situation out loud, and then the sidekick will joke about it. And the sidekick will really perform as the fool does in the horror dynamic, and comments on the seriousness happening around them, and they lighten things up and let the audience laugh and relax in between the intense action, fighting, and drama, and romance, and all of that. That's the sidekick. And sometimes the sidekick will betray the hero, and then sometimes they go back on the betrayal and then end up helping the helping the hero in the last second. I've read about that happening more often than I've seen it. But I feel like nowadays in movies and games, you can usually tell who's going to turn on you. They're usually just they act shifty from the very beginning. So I feel like it's not usually the sidekick, so often now. But maybe that's just in the type of media I usually see. Maybe in detective stories or cop stories, people's sidekicks are constantly turning on them. Sidekick. Related to the sidekick, kind of the foil to the sidekick, is the second in villainy, which is basically just the sidekick to the antagonist. And sometimes this character doesn't even have lines. They just sit in the background and go, and look intimidating, and add to the atmosphere of the main antagonist, because it's like, oh, look, we listen to him. He's to be taken seriously because strong people listen to him. Brr. That kind of thing. And so that's the second in villainy. And sometimes this character is like the Smee. He's almost just like if the villain isn't an effeminate villain that is the foil to the masculinity of the hero. If you have a masculine villain, a lot of times their second in command will be basically totally gay. They'll be, and I don't mean that in a derogatory way, I mean they'll have all the stereotypical aspects of being gay, and they'll be a servant who is like close to their master beyond understanding, other than maybe there's a relationship going on there. That happens a lot, and maybe I'm imagining some of it, but that sort of implied homoerotic partner of the villain, you see that a lot. And then not related to that, I guess I'll skip those two parts because this video is running long. Next is the love interest. And the love interest is sadly self-explanatory, because the love interest often doesn't get to do anything or be anything other than the thing that the hero is interested in. And that is sad, because it's just lazy. It's just lazy writing when you can't communicate a realistic person that somebody would love. Is just like, look, it's a person and she's pretty. That's enough, right? And it's like, no, that's, what are you, an idiot? No, like you have to actually make a character there. Like the love interest has to be a character. Love interest just can't be pretty. Whatever gender, make the love interest more than pretty, please. Pretty please. Related to the love interest character, who sometimes gets to act as a sidekick, and sometimes the sidekick kind of acts like a love interest, especially in cowboy westerns, which again is a genre with more homoeroticism than people would like to admit. The love interest will have, they'll have a supporting role, and they'll also have their own foil sometimes, which is the rival love interest. And sometimes the rival love interest is the girlfriend of the enemy, or the wife or love interest or mistress of the enemy. And sometimes it's part of a love triangle. It's basically the other woman. A lot of times it'll be the brunette, and the lead blonde is who we're supposed to be rooting for to hook up with the hero in our nice German Saxon story. But this is clearly subverted more and more, and people get sick of seeing that and think it's kind of weird and oddly racist, so they don't do that quite as much. And sometimes you'll have the rival love interest be the blonde that is represented by, the blonde who represents ditziness and shallowness, and that's problematic for another whole slew of reasons. But yes, rival love interest will often be distinguishable from the love interest by some physical trait like hair color. And that's lazy writing, to be honest. You can use it to get through a first draft, but try to define people by more than just one aspect of their appearance, because it's very shallow. And your writing of that character is going to be really, really difficult if you can't see them as just a person who responds to situations like a person, and you're trying to think of them like, what would a woman do here? Like, no, just think, what would I do there? What would a person do there? What would a person who has a history of not taking shit from anybody do in this situation in response to what you just did? That's how you think of characters, not what would a African American female do in this? Like, no, that's not the way to approach that. Okay, so that's the rival love interest. And then the other two archetypes involved in this kind of classic arc that I almost won't bother mentioning is the mayor, and the mayor, or the president, or the king, can be very competent or very ridiculous, and or can be a queen who is very competent or very ridiculous and very mean, and there are political implications to all of that. And if you include a politician in your work, people will definitely look to that to see what your political views are. So be careful if you have a king or a president or a mayor or something like that, because be aware that people will be reading it for, this is what the author believes should be the case. If you have a queen who's just mean to everyone, they're going to think like, oh, the author thinks women can't be in control. If you have a king that's mean to everyone, people will be like, oh, that's why we don't have kings. But politics are complicated, and the meaning of symbols change, so good luck writing. And that kind of brings me, with the whole kings and queens, to my next topic, or my next part of stock characters, which is an incredibly long section of this video, I know, but that's what I said. Stock characters can also be historical characters. Leaving aside all of these dynamics of all of these webs of ways that characters interact and their different philosophies reflect off each other, You can just have George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, Jesus Christ, and Theodore Roosevelt, and I picked a bunch of presidents and Jesus, which is kind of weird, but that's history here in America. You can just grab a bunch of historical characters, and Napoleon. Everybody throws in Napoleon. And you can just use those. You can just use, to get through a first draft. But yeah, go ahead. Use historical characters. Use historical character names. Related still to that power writing, that getting through the first draft, getting through the planning, getting through the first write out of the scenes. Use historical characters. Use celebrities. Use people you know. Use your parents. Use teachers. I have had some animated teachers, like people I will not forget. Just, not necessarily because they were very intelligent, but just because they were very memorable as characters. Use that. Use them. Use people you have to interact with, basically. But don't write about them in a way that they'll be able to tell. Too obviously, or they might be offended if they ever see it. Or you can just be like, you know what, this is what I'm doing. If you find my story and you get offended, so what, I don't like you. Now you know. You can have that attitude. Sometimes it makes for good writing. Alright. Oh yeah, you can also use, I know I said famous actors, but famous actors who always play the same part. Basically like Al Pacino, Robert De Niro, Christopher Walken, those kinds of people. Nicolas Cage to some extent. People who are, Arnold Schwarzenegger is another one. People who are famous for basically always being the same person in movies. And yeah, they do different things here and there, but they mostly get hired to be themselves. And you can use that. Try not to make it too obvious. Try not to write in the story like, this guy who acts like Nick Cage looks like Nick Cage, and that's why. It's like, that doesn't have very much impact. And especially as time goes on, it's probably going to seem more and more crazy that you even bothered to mention an actor, because people might not know that person at all. You have no idea what's going to be popular in 50 years or 100 years. So just assume that any actor you're talking about has disappeared to history, and just describe them as a new character, basically. And that'll also give you more freedom to mess with their appearance or their the way they solve problems, their mannerisms, stuff like that. Okay, and now we finally get to the revision section of this video. And believe it or not, I only have a page of notes, but I've talked for a long time. Revising. Okay, so revising for mood and impact. The first thing I would say, and this again I have to attribute to Goldberry Long, but I've also read it in other places. This idea of cutting adverbs. The adverbs, verbs that end in ly, swiftly, quickly, wryly, stuff like that, they are evil. They are quicksand. They are mud in your story. And it's one of those things where it seems insane the first time you hear it. And I remember hearing it, and I'm still kind of skeptical when I hear it out loud. I think, why would that possibly make a difference? But if you come across a work that has way too many adverbs in it and way too many adjectives instead of strong verbs, it is so exhausting. It is so exhausting. It gets, and it's the kind of thing where if you didn't know that rule, you would just think this feels so old. Like the style just feels so old. It's just the sentences are so long, and it's not in like a lot of stuff happens in the sentence way. It's like there are just so many modifiers on every single noun and it just goes to a standstill when you try to read it. If you're feeling like that in your story, like you just take way too many words to get through the actions and word and dialogue that need to happen, cut those. Cut all your adverbs. And a lot of times they'll be implied anyways if you pick a good verb. If you pick an action word that implies speed, that implies anger, like instead of he put the phone down, say he slammed the phone down. He pounded the phone against the receiver. He I think I used slam. He smashed the phone down, and chucked it through the window. Don't say like he placed it on the receiver and with some help from his wrist, it kindly exited the window. That's something like that being deliberately understated in a way can be funny, but if you want to if you want it to feel like you're in that room and that person is just like got serious on you, it's gonna be more impactful to read he slammed it down than to read he put it down mad, or like he put it down angrily, he put it down forcefully. Just he slammed it. It's, those verbs really make a difference, and cutting adjectives. Don't go crazy cutting adjectives, because a lot of times they will be necessary, like numbers, or saying, he took the first of something instead of the fifth of something, took the first card instead of the fifth card from the deck. Sometimes it matters. That's a crummy example. But sometimes adjectives actually matter, and you can't delete them because they really change the situation. But if they don't, they're probably implied by either your nouns or your verbs. And if they aren't, pick better nouns or verbs. And that will be the thing to anguish over when you're revising. I made some of these other points already. If you use stock characters or stock plots a lot in your first stage, in your power writing stage, or your first draft stage of your final product, because a lot of times you're brainstorming will be to the side, and then you're like, okay, now I'm starting the document. And that'll be a new thing. When you're if you use a lot of stock characters in that second process, not just the planning process, but all throughout that first draft process, then what you want to do in revising it is going to be, one, to think of what you would do in those situations. You might know the answer to how characters sneak past the guard in this exact situation. I'm thinking of bad examples right now. But you might you might know what the obvious answer is, and you might have that in your story. But when you're going through and trying to figure out how to make it more personal, how to make it more unique and more new, more original, all of that, try to think what you would do to solve that problem, not just what is normally done in movies or in stories to solve that problem. like, if you think, if you're the kind of person that thinks, like, I wouldn't run from the killer, I'd just try to fight the killer. Everybody tries to run and they all die. Like, when you're looking at your story and you're like, everybody runs in this movie. It's like all the other movies where everybody just runs and then they trip and then they die, Use that impulse to think, like, if I was there, I'd try to fight him, and have one of your characters try to fight him, Try to use your, or the opposite, like, why does everybody just run and try to fight the killer? Like, why doesn't anybody try to figure out what's wrong? Like, why doesn't anybody try to solve the mystery of this serial killer's death or whatever, and try to avenge them, and treat them like, an upset ghost instead of just like a random maniac. Try to solve the problem in a new way, especially if you've already written the thing and you just have a bunch of stuff that feels too cliche, too, like, you've seen it too many times. Try to bring what you would do to those situations in your revisions and reworkings. And also your planning stages, if you can help it. And save yourself from writing the cliche scenes and just plan and then skip right along to something a little more original. But you can't always do that. So that's one idea. You can also use, and I know I've said this before, but you can use family members, you can use teachers, you can also use friends or pets. I know that sometimes when I'm writing animal creatures, I'm writing thinking of one of my dogs or thinking of my cat, and thinking about how they specifically, and how other animals, but my animals specifically, respond to a situation. And that will help me kind of revise an animal to be more authentic and less of just like a prop that just sits there in the scene and then once in a while knocks something over or something, which is kind of what a cat is, but you can have them be more than that in the story. Also, one of the things you can do is use celebrities and political figures from your own time as kind of stock characters. And it's popular to use, like I mentioned, George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, to use people like that as stock characters. But you could also use Obama as a stock character. You can use recent presidents, recent prime ministers, wherever you live, or even low-level people. Use your own mayor, your own congressman. If you think that they would work as a character in something you're doing, use them. Probably change the name to keep yourself from trouble. But, use the world around you in your writing. And if you do that and combine that with the work of the past and stock characters and the familiar, the sort of historically familiar in media, then you'll be off to a pretty damn good start, if I do say so myself. And to wrap up, I really just want to say thank you for watching so much of this video, one, but also, avoid, now my brain has stopped working. Avoid variations of the word said and, like murmured, whispered, shouted, answered, stuff like that. That gets exhausting too. It's kind of like the adverbs thing, where if nobody ever told you that rule, you would just think, well, this is how writing is. This is how good writing is. But if you read it in somebody else's work, you're like, wow, this is old-fashioned. It doesn't need all of that. It doesn't need all of those variations of the word said. Just use the word said. Or what I like to do much more often is use action as an attribution. So it'll say, like, thank you, Kyle took the glass from the host of the party. And that'll imply, maybe not that sentence so clearly, but, or like, thank you, Kyle put the glass down. Something like that, within that one line, demonstrates that it's Kyle who is saying thank you and putting the glass down. Or, like, thanks for everything, Kyle slammed the glass down. You know, that says something else entirely. And you don't have to say, Kyle said angrily, and then put the glass down really hard, so hard that it broke. You know, use things economically. Use characters as often as you can. Use as few words as possible. And you'll save yourself a lot of hassle and a lot of frustration and a lot of guilt that you're not coming up with enough new stuff. Reuse stuff within your own work and from previous works, and revise with originality in mind and clarity in mind and mood and all of that, and you'll be okay. And one more point for revision. Whether you're using a stock character or a character from your life or from popular culture and the media or history or whatever, is try to have your character be different in a substantial way by the end of the story from the events of the story. Try to have them be different than they are at the end than they are at the beginning. Or else it feels like the story didn't impact them really. Like it wasn't really... almost like the story wasn't worth telling. Like everything was... you know, nothing was changed by it. If nothing is changed by your story and everything's exactly the same at the end of it, you know, everything's back to normal in the last 2 or 3 minutes, then it seems too static. It seems like not enough has changed. And try to make, you know, your character doesn't have to learn a lesson in a really straightforward and explicit way, you know, like it's a fairy tale or something, but they should be different. They should be more brave, more confident, more, you know, they should be stronger, they should be more agile, they should be more in control of their life now that the events of the story have transpired, you know. Yeah. But mostly, just start and keep at it. And it will get done if you just keep writing. It will. Promise. Peace.